So good to see your face. Doing so well, just running around with kid and
So I'm so grateful to be having this conversation with you. So something that's so close to my heart. So my partner is Black and our children are biracial, but they will be raised as strong Black men. And I wanted to have a conversation with you. It's not your responsibility in any way to educate me, but I kind of wanted to have an open dialogue about what that means. And I have absolutely no experience myself being a white woman, and I'm so uneducated. I grew up in Australia in it's a bubble. It's where I grew up is very white, and my parents being Italian, we were I guess that was as cultural as it got. It was a lot of Italians and Greeks, but that was the extent until I moved to America. So now I have these two amazing, gorgeous children, and it's so important to their father to be raised as strong Black men and to have good role models around them. So I guess my first question is, what advice do you have? Like straight off the bat, it's so new to me, so different, and something I have no experience with.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can speak to my own experiences being a mixed child and my mom being white and my dad being Ghanaian, West African, and both of them really making sure that we were very aware of our identity and very proud of it, that they would, give us opportunities to be educated on what it meant to be African and African American and what it meant to be mixed, and just kind of to have that space to explore our identities. And what I think my mom did really well was she never tried to make any kind of assumption about our identity. She never tried to insert herself into our shoes as if she could know what it was like to be a Black person in the United States and in the many different places where we grew up, because we were in Dubai, Estonia, Mexico, Sweden, Azerbaijan. So she, everywhere we went, spoke about, because people really highlighted our differences. When you're a mixed kid and you're walking around with your mom and are clearly a different race than her, people make these weird comments or will say, kind of strange things, which I'm sure you've maybe experienced. And she was just very clear on correcting those conversations with us one-on-one, making sure that we were always in open dialogue about how other people were seeing us, or even seeing our relationship with our mom, so that we could ask any questions and better understand the role of race, as well as gender and all these intersecting identities. So I would say, based off that experience, to not shy away from the conversation, to be very celebratory of difference. Difference is a great thing, and it's, an unfortunate lesson that many of us learned, that difference is something to be afraid of, or that we shouldn't highlight it too much, or we should speak more about how much we have in common, which of course that's important, in terms of our interconnectedness as humans, but it's also very cool to say our difference is something to be celebrated. It brings a lot of strengths. We can learn from each other based off of these different experiences and the different ways we walk through the world, and also acknowledge when it can be difficult and sometimes uncomfortable because other people around you don't seem to understand it in the same way that you and your family do. So just continuing to have that open dialogue, because they'll have experiences throughout their lives that you never had. And they'll come home trying to understand maybe something that happened to them, whether that's a good or a bad thing, exposure to something that you maybe never experienced. But I think making sure that you're always there for them as a confidant, as someone who's willing to learn and listen, was really important for us as Black children with a white mom.
Do you remember those experiences growing up, walking through a shopping center and people saying things to your mom?
Oh, definitely. All the time. I mean, I remember very clearly always being stared at. Like there was this notion that people just found us to be intriguing and, maybe even exotic, that they just wanted to stare at us. And, sometimes I think, and my mom would say, sometimes maybe it's a compliment, they think that you are beautiful children. They're intrigued by us. She's like, but it also isn't okay that they make you feel. So let's talk about that. I remember very clearly at some point in Dubai, someone asked my mom right in front of us where she got us from. So my mom, who gave birth to her children, was asked, where did you get your children? But absolutely bizarre, and It's also, quite interesting because we also look quite different from our father, because we're mixed, but everybody has these very kind of reduced notions of color. And so there was no question that we were ever his children, but it was very questionable that we were somehow this white woman's children. So she experienced those questions far more often than our dad did. And she just dealt with it really well. I mean, she also showed her strength in those moments. She was very clear that she wasn't going to, just smile or let that go. She would use that opportunity to correct that person's assumption about families and how different we all can be, and what, disrupting whatever the notion of the traditional family is. So we also remember her responses to those awkward moments. She would stand up tall and say, these are my biological children. And even if they weren't, it's not okay for you to ask me where I got them from as if they were objects or commodities. These are my kids. So that was great. And it was powerful. And that allowed us to say, okay, it's also all right to challenge others when they clearly have very kind of myopic views of race.
And then yourself, you grew up biracial, but you obviously would have seen the vast difference between white children growing up and then you yourself being mixed, and then obviously Black children. Yeah. How do you think that changed from when you grew up to now, and then your experience with that, with seeing color,
Yeah, it's interesting because our experience of traveling abroad, and probably with your kids, if you're going to be going back and forth between the US and Australia, it's going to be so different because in the US, it's, a very different conversation. There's race issues all over the world, but there's something very unique about race conversations in the United States. And so because I was abroad from 2 years old until 13, I actually felt I had a very strange understanding of my identity as a Black American, because I felt somehow I was separate of it. I kind of fell into the trick that the African American diaspora was like one meaning and one identity and one category that I somehow didn't fit. And so it was very naive of me, but I just didn't understand my relationship to it. It wasn't until I was even in college, honestly, that I had this awakening and understood how silly my notion of Black identity was, because I very clearly fit into it. This is what the African diaspora is. It's so beautifully rich with diversity and nuance. There are many of us, yes, who were born and raised in one place and have this proud identity, like Michael does, born and raised in Stockton, California, has always probably had a very clear and clear understanding of his identity as a Black male. There's many of us who were third culture kids and traveled all over the place. Many of us who have mixes within our families, and that is a part of the Black American experience. And so I was able to see that I was a part of this incredible community, and I could use the ways in which I'd advocated for many different things in following my mom's footsteps with women's advocacy and children's advocacy to speak with my community of Black Americans. And I really stepped into that, so much so that my second year in college, I was president of our Black Student Union. I was fully embracing for the first time that beautifully rich nuance. And I think that's important for your kids as well. They're going to have a different experience, but really everybody has this very different experience. And that's part of the strength of our Black community, is how different we all are.
And say my children don't grow up in America, it's so important for their dad, for them to have that understanding. So what can I do from them growing up here? How can I educate them on what that would be like?
I think keeping them as connected as possible to that identity, whether that's, even, it sounds silly, but through music and through culture and through food and through books, and knowing, who their leaders were and are, in terms of leaders that are that for the world. Of course, names like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. and Toni Morrison and James Baldwin are part of the world. And it's so important for them to also feel connected to that, because whether you're in the US or you're separate of it, you still have some awareness of the issues that are happening in the US because of this overpowering nature that America has throughout the world and how much it's spoken about. We always were aware of what was happening, but took us a while to feel connected to it. And although our parents tried, I think there was maybe even more that we could have done to be better educated on like these literary figures that I've mentioned. And it's something I wish I'd been exposed to a little earlier. I think I would have felt even more that sense of pride at an earlier age. Even though my parents did a great job of that, and I never felt that notion of like stereotype threat that everybody speaks about, where many Black people in the US already think in their minds they're going to perform badly on something because someone has told them that that's what's going to happen to a Black person. I never had that notion either. I didn't even learn about stereotype threat until, again, I was in college and was shocked that anyone would have told me that I was going to do badly. I never felt that at all. My parents made sure I was always aware that I was excellent and was going to do great things in the world, and nothing was going to stop me from doing that.
I know that another thing that my partner and friends of mine struggled with is that they've always had to be the best in whatever they've decided to be passionate about. They had to be the best to stand out. Is that something that you felt like you didn't, because you weren't in the US until that later age, that you weren't really, I guess you didn't have to struggle with, or is it just a global thing?
It's interesting because each place where we lived, I had a different experience with race. So, and because of my age as well, maybe it was also part of like my growing awareness. But in Dubai, the first place we lived outside of the US, I didn't feel much of a notion of it in terms of having to prove myself. I just always was a competitive kid, and I always wanted to be the best and like, you know, get the best grades. My parents always joke about that it wasn't because they told me I needed to. I just had this notion of like, I'm going to be the best and I'm going to succeed. And then when we were in Estonia, I became a little bit more aware that some people didn't like me because of the color of my skin and the remnants of the Soviet Union, and how somebody out of nowhere could just call me the N-word. And I had no idea why they didn't like me. So I started to understand that a little better. And then in Mexico, it wasn't as overt, but there was clearly colorism in play. And not only with Black people, but with, you know, indigenous people in Mexico. And I started to become aware that there were these dynamics at play because of the color of skin. And I think I just kind of carried forward my notion that I just wanted to be the best, but I didn't realize the pressure of I have to work harder than everybody else, again, until I had a better understanding of the sociology of it, when I became better educated on the theory of it. So I'm actually quite grateful for my kind of naiveness in that sense, because I wasn't aware that anybody was asking me to prove anything. And even when I was in boarding school in Indiana, you know, around the same area where the second kind of rising of the Ku Klux Klan happened, so there's definitely remnants of that there. I had teachers, these white teachers, white male teachers, who were constantly reminding me that I was the smartest person in the class. And they wrote my rec letters for Stanford. It was 3 white men, and they believed in me fully. And so somehow I avoided that. And I think that there are ways to take that pressure off of kids. If they want to just do well to do well, that's great. But it's sometimes a little early, I think, to be aware of the world putting that pressure on your shoulders. And I think as parents, we can tell them that this is a reality, but also allow them to let go of some of that burden when they're around us.
And do you and Michael have conversations like that? I don't know, because me and my partner, we have conversations that I don't understand. Do you guys have conversations about like what age you will have to have a harder conversation with them? That, you know, my 2 sons, one of them is a lot darker than the other. Sorry, it's so emotional as a mother to have a conversation. You know, when my baby James came out, he's white, he's very white. And I don't think it was until he came out that I realized the difference that the boys would have. Sorry. You know, based on the color of their skin, their lives will be very different because of the way that people will approach them, the way that people will engage with them and judge them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what age do you have that conversation and to tell your child, your sweet, innocent child, you know?
Yeah, of the ugliness and the pain of the world. I know. And it's something that, gosh, I have so much I could say about it. On one hand, it's something that my mom often spoke about, you know, so the book that I've written most recently is all about 3 Black mothers. So, you know, of course they were Black moms, and there was something very politicizing about having children because, I mean, they were already very active, and I can talk about that later, but having your children, it awakens something else in you, especially when your children are Black children, because you're aware that the world will treat them differently than the way you see them. You see them as the most magical, incredible beings that are just so sweet, and so you just will do anything to protect them. And when you're aware of all the different strategies in place and attacks that could happen, you also just can't accept it, you know. So I think that's why those of us who have Black children, whether we ourselves are Black or not, feel a sense of, I cannot just accept this. I will protect them with everything that I have, and I will change systems and get people to change their minds while I'm here on this earth, to make their lives as easy as I possibly can, to give them the same opportunities that other people have access to. And it is emotional because we feel we have to do that in order to feel okay, day in and day out, that we're doing everything we can to protect them and to protect their lives. So it's something that I think is very emotional and also very politicizing, and it motivates us to have this dialogue, to have these conversations. What's something that I've struggled with and that Michael and I have discussed, like you said, is like, when do you have that conversation? And part of it is like, do you wait until the world like bursts the bubble, or do you prep them before anything can even happen? But does that somehow, you know, mess them up, because then are they looking for those moments to happen? So I think our strategy is exposure to our history as much as possible through these different stories, so that they can learn about struggle even through somebody else at first. And then if they ever are to encounter it, they can base their decision off of the different people they've been introduced to, and even telling them our own stories. A big part of my book is making sure that people are aware that when mothers share their stories, it helps their children. When we don't erase our identity or become this sort of, you know, altruistic being that doesn't have their own feelings or their own emotions, but instead is a whole human who feels pain and joy, and has been through her own problems and wants to use those to help their children understand the world, then I think that allows them to say, oh, okay, so I've experienced something. I want to go back and talk to my mom about it. She was always really honest with me, and she wanted to help me understand things. And that's the thing. I mean, whether it's race or anything else our children can encounter, there are things that we can't protect them from, but hopefully we've established a close enough relationship that they'll come back to us so that we can help them through it as much as possible. But I don't know, it's so scary to think about having a Black child and thinking about your son going out there and the world treating him so differently than you would want them to be treated.
It is scary.
It's terrifying.
Yeah. What empowers you the most about being a mother?
Oh, you know, it's so cool. My privilege of studying motherhood in like both the academy and in writing this book for general audiences outside of the ivory tower is that I see motherhood as so influential and powerful and strong. I think, unfortunately, many moms have been tricked into thinking that our role doesn't really matter, or that it's okay for it to be taken for granted. It's okay that we're not thanked or given credit. We again feel that we have to be these very humble beings who just do whatever we can for everybody else, and nobody does the same for us. And we're holding, you know, even we see in the pandemic, women, and especially women of color, are taking on these burdens exponentially more than those around them. And I just see that as something that I don't accept, and I'm not okay with it. And so even in my relationship with my partner, I'm very clear, like, nighttime, like once Malachi was in his crib at 5 months, like, you've got it now. Like, I did the pregnancy, I did the labor, I nursed him through those first 5 months. I mean, I nursed him for 16 months. He just weaned. But at night, like, you've got this, man. This is the part where you can step up. And mornings, I will sleep in. Like, you've got the morning shift before you start work. You can give him breakfast. And a lot of people, I think that's just acceptable. It feels like a way that you can, in some way, even out our responsibilities, because it's in many ways quite difficult in heteronormative relationships where you have biological children to make it even. There's no way that he's ever going to be able to know what it was like to be pregnant or to go through 15 hours of labor. But this is at least a way where he can say, I'm doing my part and I'm doing as much as I can. And we've received comments from people who are like, oh, wow, Anna, like, you really have him trained, or blah, blah, blah. And what I appreciate about my partner is that he says, no, this is like my role to play. This is also my child. And that's crucial. And I think had I not been studying this for a couple years before I became a mom, I would have very easily fallen into, again, traditional notions of male and female roles and thought this is just what I'm supposed to do. And he can't go take care of him because maybe he doesn't even know how to. So I also had to accept that he was going to maybe do things a little differently in the mornings, and maybe not always give him, the full breakfast that I would want him to, but I still could allow him to also be a father and be a parent. And I'm grateful for that. And I also correct people all the time when they say things to me like, your son is so strong, just like his dad, or your son is so smart, maybe he's going to become a mayor. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. Maybe he's going to become a writer like his mom. And I'm also very strong, and I'm also very intelligent. And I do that not only to speak for myself, but for all moms. I am so sick and tired of us being unrecognized.
And then tell me about your book. So it's about the mothers of these amazing pioneers. So studying them must have been incredible and overwhelming and just so many things.
It was so fun. It was so much fun, and hard as well to even find the details about their lives that had been scattered and erased in many ways. Also to kind of walk through their lives and how painful it was as Black women in the United States during Jim Crow, and again, having their children in the 1920s, and, the fears that we very much feel right now to an extent that really is almost unimaginable. But yeah, the book is about Alberta King, Bertus Baldwin, and Louise Little. They're the mothers of Martin Luther King Jr., James Baldwin, and Malcolm X, respectively. And I talk about celebrating their identities before they became moms to really, understand that they were very important, whether or not they'd ever given birth to these famous men, but also to celebrate their motherhood. For all three of them, it was something they were extremely proud of. I think as modern women, we also feel that we have to kind of choose between one or the other, that even if we have children, that somehow someone's going to be upset with us if we say, I'm so proud of being a mom, and it's something that I really care about, and like I think is an important part of my identity. It's almost as professional women, people want us to not speak about it. And I don't want that either. I want us to celebrate the role as it deserves to be celebrated. And then also to speak about the tragedy. Unfortunately, with all three of them, they outlived their famous sons. And in two of the cases, they lost two children before they passed away. And to say, this isn't something that we should accept. It's not something that is okay. It's to learn from the circumstances that were at play, the issues that were at play, and how I think Alberta, Louise, and Bertus would have wanted us to continue fighting that today. I'm not going to accept that my child, simply because he's a Black child, is going to go out into the world and have to deal with this, or that I have to deal with more fear than other mothers. I find that to be unacceptable. And I want more people, even outside of our community, even outside of moms who have Black children, to have that same feeling. This is unacceptable. We all have to do something about this. And I think the world is changing. I am an optimist. I think that there has been progress, but we can't allow that to allow us to be complacent. And there's just always more work to be done and more to push for. So I just feel like I'm joining them in that fight for not only my own humanity to be recognized, but that of my children as well.
They were so incredibly courageous and brave, especially for those times. What other characteristics did you, once you were researching them, see that they had a pattern between them that enabled them to be these strong women themselves, and then to also raise these strong children that were ended up being pioneers?
Yeah, and in a lot of ways they were so different from each other. So it was a celebration of their different approaches to that. Because so often Black women are put in these categories of like, matriarch or mammy or strong woman, like all of these like really angry Black women. There's so many of these categories that I was like, I want to break those apart and really celebrate their nuances and their differences. But the ways in which they came together were also very beautiful. The way that they all three told their children about their worth, about the dignity that they deserved, the respect that they deserved, despite what they were going to see beyond their homes, and that they needed to participate in that change, that they couldn't just accept it. And that was crucial for me as well. Again, not accepting it, but instead thinking about strategies for not only surviving, but also living our lives with joy, and not only focusing on pain and the possibilities of pain, but to think about the possibility of change and reimagining our world and being a part of that change. So that was inspiring in all three cases. They were very different though. Bertus was, I don't think she would have called herself an activist, even though I considered her to be one, but she wrapped her children in love. She knew that all she could control was how she treated her children. And so she built a home that was built on love and light, and finding, the optimism despite how hard the darkness could be. And she would say to them, I don't know what's going to happen to you when you leave my house, or you leave the door or walk out the door, but I want people to treat you the way I've treated you, and I want you to treat people the way that I've treated you. So she led in that kind of example. Louise Little, on the other hand, was a radical kind of badass activist. She was at the forefront of this Marcus Garvey movement for Pan-Africanism. She believed in Black independence and Black pride. And the way she taught her children that was she never backed down from a fight. She never wanted to cower in front of these white supremacists. She wanted them to see what she wanted them to do in those moments where somebody questioned you. You stand up for yourself. And that might mean you're risking your life, but it's more important to live your life with that dignity and that respect. And it's something that I think Bertus would have said, whoa, 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 like you're risking your life, you're risking their lives. And Louise would have said that I would rather do that than the alternative. And then Alberta King bases all of her lessons in faith. And she's obviously her parents are the leaders of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, which is still famous today. And they teach her that faith can't be faith without social justice. So as part of being Christians, you fight for the oppressed, and you fight for the poor, and you make this vision and their faith of what the Lord had for the world, of all of us being equal. You make that a reality while you're here on earth. So yeah, very different in their approaches, but similar in the theme that they were communicating.
It's a balance, right? Like you said, it's about being this pioneer and not backing down, and teaching your kids to have that enough self-respect that they won't allow anyone to treat them like shit. And then also for them to know that they are loved and supported, and for them to be empathetic, and then to be that Christian that's going to go out there and make that change.
Yeah. Yeah. It
That
felt
balance,
like all three of them were sort of like on a team, just kind of playing their own role, which is similar to their sons. There were different approaches to the freedom movement that all mattered and actually made a difference. And it's not one or the other. And I say that to everybody all the time. Even now we're speaking and we condemn some for doing one thing and then say, but this is the right way. That's never been revolutionary history. All of these different tactics have mattered and have been necessary, honestly. And so it's not to castigate one or the other, but instead, even with your own children, it may be that they have different approaches to what they believe, they need to do. And one might be a writer and one might want to march and whatever. But I think, again, that exposure to how movements have worked in the past, so that there's an understanding of what's happening now. So it doesn't feel disconnected and it doesn't feel as scary because you're also part of a larger team, I think can alleviate that pressure a little bit.
Speaking of movements, obviously last year was huge.
Yeah.
I'm sure you had experiences with whether it's friends, colleagues or ignorant people that didn't understand it, didn't want to understand it. And I had so many people coming to me saying, but Rachel, all lives matter. And just people that not only were they ignorant or naive, but people that didn't want to educate themselves. I've had many conversations and lost friends over it. How have you dealt with it? And, what's your advice, I guess, for moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, especially for you, like with your Black children and people are coming up to you saying, well, all lives matter. It's like, that is not the point. That is not the point. It's not okay that my child is walking through the world with more threats against their life. That's what we're saying. Black lives matter because we're saying it, because obviously the way you're treating us is as if they don't.
Yeah.
It's like such a simple thing to understand, but people have such a hard time with it. And I think it goes back to what I was saying sort of at the beginning of people's fear of difference and celebrating difference and recognizing difference. And part of that is recognizing how that difference forces us all to live day in and day out with different realities and different challenges. And if we can recognize and celebrate difference at the beginning and that kind of be at the forefront of our mind, I think it would be easier for us to accept that that also leads to challenges that one person would have and that another person doesn't. There just needs to be an awakening that we're clearly not all the same and we're clearly not all being treated the same. And why is that so difficult to admit? I don't know why people have such a hard time with that. But for me, even in my own work, it's just about getting people to see and be okay with admitting difference. I think it's the first step. And then we can kind of maybe move forward from there, because without that, then you have all these notions that are so reductive and that erase our feelings and our experiences because people just want to say, well, all of our lives matter. Yeah, they do. That's fair. But in our world right now, they're not being treated that way. So therefore, let's focus on what's different.
It's hard because you want to find that balance. I want to get aggressive and get in their face and school them. At the same time, I'm like, maybe I should be a bit more empathetic, take a step back and take that approach to educate them. Not that I mean myself in any way educated, but to be on that journey with them. And as a mother to two Black sons,
yeah,
maybe it's my responsibility to take a step back and educate myself and then to use myself as a vessel and to educate those people and just keep persistent. Like if I can just change the mindset of, one or two people, that's a change.
Yeah. And I think it's also just like, but also not putting too much responsibility on your shoulders. And people feel different comfort levels with what they're willing to do in this kind of overall fight for lives and for freedom. And some of us are comfortable being the ones who are willing to sit down in conversation. I consider myself to be one of those people. And I think with one of my talents is writing. And I think through writing, people can come together. And you also have a space where you're just reading a book comfortably on your own. And then you maybe feel a little bit more informed to talk about something larger. And the book for me is like this invitation. I mean, it's a celebration of Black womanhood, and I want Black women, when they read it, to feel that they're seen and that they're celebrated. But anybody who is not a Black woman or a Black mother to feel invited into the conversation, maybe in a gentler way. I'm not someone who like hides things. I'm very direct in my approach, but I do know what it's like to communicate with people around the world. It's something that I've carried in my experience. And so I think that I'm willing to be that one of those people, but I also don't think that everybody has to be by any means. I think it's exhausting to constantly have to educate others or feel, that pressure. And I think it's also about taking it day by day. Some days maybe we're more willing to engage, and other days we're like, you know what, honestly, like what the comment that you just made is completely not okay. And I've blocked people before, people who I knew for years, because they got me on the wrong day and said something crazy. And I was like, not today. I can't do it. And you're going to hear from me right now. And that's the last that you're going to hear from me. And I'm not mad at myself for it. I think we're okay. It's okay for us to do that, because for many who don't understand how personal this is to us, and they speak to us as if it isn't personal and are really erasing, again, our experiences, our children's experiences, you have to be understanding with yourself too. Like, it's completely okay to cut those people out of your life. But if it's on a day that you're willing to talk to them, then maybe that's the day that another person has an awakening that's helpful.
This conversation has been so amazing. I'm so grateful.
Thank you for inviting me.
I want to talk about upcoming projects. What are you working on? Apart from having a child, having this amazing book, and you're pregnant.
It's a lot. Yeah, it's all great things though. I mean, I'm busy in the best of ways right now, and I'm so appreciative of every single moment that I get to experience what this book launch has been. And now that the book has its own like life in the world, it's so crazy. It's just out there and people can do what they want with it. But I'm working on a children's book, a picture book about the mothers, 3 mothers of contemporary Black female leaders. So I'm not saying who yet, but I'll be pitching that soon. And then I've been working on a novel for about 5 years that I'm hoping I can finally pitch this year. Novels are so much harder because with a nonfiction, you have to be kind of perfect before you pitch it, because you're imagining the world. It's not like you have to do any research or much research for it. So when publishers pick it up, they want it to be what it's pretty much going to be, and that they just have to do some small edits. But with that's a nonfiction, that's a fiction, that's a novel. And with a nonfiction, it's you write the proposal, and then you get to build the world after you get your advance. So yeah, the fiction is taking a lot longer, but it's going to be great when it's finally done. So those are my 2 writing projects. Yeah, thank you.